Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the 7th of November 2011, the podcast that cleans your windows and charges you a $5 before demolishing your home. This is your host, Shane Killian, and joining me this week is...
Lord T. Hawkeye. I'm a poster at the Bogosity forum, and I run a YouTube channel of my own, talking about gaming and politics and all that good stuff. And thank you for having me on.
Oh, I'm glad to have you. All right, before we get started with the news, one thing I keep getting requests over and over to cover is the Occupy movement.
Yes. Barrel of laughs, that is.
Yeah, well, and the thing about it is, the news media seems completely clueless as to what it is and what it's about, and I haven't really found any really good story I can use, positive or negative, to put in the podcast. So I figured we'd just talk about what we've seen both in the news and on YouTube and all the videos that have posted up that you don't get to see.
Oh, yeah. Been watching a few of those.
Well, I don't really know a whole lot. It seems to have started in September, and it was Occupy Wall Street, and now it's just blown up, so it's all over the world. There are Occupy protests all over the US, all over Canada, the UK, Spain, Germany, Belgium, all over Europe, in fact, as well as Peru, Brazil, Mongolia, Australia, and all sorts of others. And it all just seems to be based on discontent. People don't like what these big companies and these big corporations are doing.
Oh, yeah, and that's the thing that makes this really difficult. I mean, it's good that they're getting angry about it. You get the sense that a lot of them have not actually looked into where it all comes from. It's just the company did bad things, and no one really wants to get into more detail about it. And to me, that ends up being very dangerous because you can end up harming your own cause if you really don't know who the enemy really is.
Right. It's not like they always say the secret to activism is ready, aim, fire. And in a lot of ways, I think they seem to have skipped the first two.
Oh, yeah.
My first thought when I heard they were doing these protests on Wall Street, it's like, go a block and a half over to the Federal Reserve Building.
Oh, yeah.
That's where you should be.
Well, some of them did do that, but I'm not even sure if those people fully understand the whole gravity of it all.
Well, as it's going on and they seem to get a little more traction and get a little more of a footing and more of an idea of what they're about, we start to see a lot of these things like people are calling to end the Fed or at least audit the Fed.
Yeah, which would definitely help, but you know the Fed is going to fight that every step of the way.
Well, just like they did last time, yeah.
And even what little they managed to do audit the Fed, it still revealed some pretty disturbing things, I'd have to say.
Yeah, it was $16 trillion to all those banks and corporations.
Yes, and people say these are the guys who are going to protect the poor from the rich. I mean, hello?
No, it's the other way around.
Oh, yeah.
And that's where I think they're going astray because they keep talking about how, you know, we need to do these things, which are the things that they're already doing. We need more regulation of banks because they're coming from this mistaken idea that somehow the banks were deregulated when actually tens of thousands of pages of regulation were added every year.
Oh, yeah. I ask these people all the time, can you tell me what regulation was removed that would have prevented these tragedies we're seeing now? And I can't get an answer out of them. I try as I might, I just can't.
The only answer I've ever gotten is that they say that they call it the repeal of Glass-Steagall. It's really a Gramm-Leach-Bliley, and it didn't repeal Glass-Steagall at all. What Glass-Steagall was it was passed in the Great Depression, and it created the FDIC. Well, one of the things they did was that they separated out the different types of accounts that these different firms can have, so that if you're a bank and you have deposits and people have their savings there, then the FDIC guarantees it to, I think it was initially $10,000, and then they upped it to $100,000 in the 80s. And if you had things like mortgage accounts and credit accounts, those weren't covered. But what Gramm-Leach-Bliley did, or one of the things that it did, was remove that distinction. And what that meant was that these FDIC protections were now expanded to mortgage accounts. So the effect was an extension of government protections. I don't call that deregulation.
No, not really. And it's just what happens when you have a third party who has no personal involvement in the exchange between a bank and their customers meddling around with it. Because he doesn't stand to lose anything if he does something stupid, well, what do you end up with? There's this huge tendency to evade blaming the government, even when, no matter how blatant it is. Like,
I know.
One of the things I really find infuriating is people who accuse Wall Street and things like that of corrupting politicians by offering them bribes in order to game the system. I say, isn't it politicians' job to say no to things like that? I mean,
politicians aren't even supposed to have the power to do that to begin with.
Oh, no. Because, like, say, if wherever you work or wherever I work, if a customer bribed me to do something wrong or unethical, my boss isn't going to go after the customer for that. He's going to fire me because I showed that I don't have integrity and I should not be working there.
Yeah, but it's just like the thing we saw with the fire department that just sat back and let the home burn, and everyone said, oh, this is a problem with private fire departments, until it came out that it wasn't a private fire department, it was a city-run fire department, and then everyone shut up.
Oh, yeah.
And then the same thing happened a few weeks later with a different city fire department out in California, I think, and not a peep out of that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, people say there'd be no fire departments if the government didn't run everything. It said, that's starting to happen now. You're seeing fire departments shutting down all over, and basically every doomsday prophecy they say about having not enough government is happening with government. It's just so topsy-turvy, and it's amazing how consistent the pattern is.
But talking about these corporations, the whole point of a corporation is to reach out to a demographic to make money. So if you've got a product that homemakers need, cleaning products or whatever, that's what you reach out to. You target the advertising towards them, and you reach out to them and you try to get their money. Well, by giving themselves the power to grant these favors in the first place, the politicians have made themselves a target demographic for it. And the corporations are just behaving the same way they would with everyone else.
Yeah, and the tragic thing is, you can't really blame the company that much. Like, a CEO who says, no, I'm not going to lobby governments to give us a favor, we're bigger than that, he's going to get fired and replaced with a CEO who will do that. There's no way to avoid it.
In fact, you could argue that he would be violating his fiduciary duty if he didn't do it. And even if the company did have some kind of policy where, oh, we're just not going to do that, their competition is going to be giving all these campaign favors and everything else, and then they're going to find themselves on the raw end of the deal when it comes to all these new regulations that are coming out.
It's a distinction that people don't seem to make. In a coercive situation, such as with government, corruption makes you more competitive, while in a voluntary situation, it makes you less competitive. You can see this all over, too.
Right.
It's like in a voluntary situation where there's no government involvement. If you're being corrupt, if you're doing things that the public doesn't approve of, the public just takes their money elsewhere, and that's it. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah, I mean, people say, well, government has accountability because we vote and corporations don't. Well, we vote, once every 2 or 4 years or 6, depending on the office. But with corporations, you vote many different times a day sometimes. When you look at the gas station and say, oh, that's too much, I'm going to go a few blocks down to this other gas station where it's a couple cents cheaper, that's a vote of sorts. You're holding that gas station accountable for having a price that's too high.
And not only that, it's a vote with money behind it. Every single lost vote is lost money. In the case of voting for politicians, not that huge a loss. I mean, they don't even know who exactly voted for them.
Right. Have you seen these lists the Occupy movement keeps coming out with? And it's really hard to phrase that because there is no one big all-encompassing movement. It's a grassroots thing. So you can't paint them all with the same brush. But like every now and then someone comes out with this list of grievances. Have you seen any of those?
Oh, yes. Yeah, it's the one, just the most ridiculous things. And some of these are just outright hypocritical. Like, when you're going after Wall Street and saying it was wrong for them to get all these big bailouts and then turn around and say that you should start subsidizing our education, how is that any different?
Yeah, that's a bailout. But some of the later ones, they do seem to be adding in some good things like, again, ending the Fed and ending corporate personhood, which I think the devil might be in the details on that one. If you do it the wrong way, it could backfire. But ultimately, I think getting rid of the idea of this legal fiction of this thing that isn't a person having all the rights of a person. They've got some good ideas, and it seems like in a lot of ways they're going on the right track.
Yeah, the whole thing with corporations is basically the whole problem with them, crony capitalism. You've got what they call privatization of profits, but socialization of risks. So it's giving someone a blank check in a casino and naively thinking something good's going to come out of it. It's not going to happen.
Although, will you do me a favor?
Yeah, what's that?
Please stop calling it crony capitalism. I die a little inside every time someone says that.
I know, it's difficult to find the right way, but...
Because it's not capitalism. Part of capitalism is accepting losses, and that's what cronyism and corporatism all get rid of.
Yeah, I think I can stick with cronyism. That'll work just fine.
Okay, good. Yeah, and I think it's interesting that, because I've seen a few videos where there's one with Gary Johnson I believe it was Reason TV that had this video, and he goes out and talks to the protesters from his libertarian mindset. And when he actually gets people who he can talk with and have him back and forth with, it turns out we've got a lot of stuff in common.
Yeah, not so much when Peter Schiff went out, but he was talking to a whole group, and it's a whole different ballgame when that happens.
Well, and he's one of those rich guys, and they're all evil, of course.
Oh, yeah. I have a friend always wondered, where is this arbitrary line where you cross from good to evil based on your wealth? Like if you're worth $999,000, you're okay, but once you cross into 1 million, now suddenly you're a bad guy. Where exactly is this line drawn?
I don't know. A guy who made, $500,000, but got it through government bailouts that allowed him to run his corporation into the ground and destroy a lot of jobs. I think a lot less than him than I do of a guy who has $2 million that he earned by making a product and putting it on the market that people actually wanted and use.
Oh, yeah. I mean, from a basic point, what exactly is wrong with that? I really would like to know from some of these people, but to the Wall Street protesters, I admire your spirit, I admire the intentions, but please, educate yourselves. Trust me, if you don't, you're playing right into the hands of the very people who exploited you. You may not understand who that really is, but trust me, if you look at all the facts, you will see who it is, and it may not be who you think.
Well, let's deliver a Tabasco pizza to the news of the Bogus. And first off, there's this Inner One company. I believe I'm pronouncing that right. They're another one of these energy companies like Solyndra. You remember them? They got all this stimulus money from the government, and then they went out of business. Well, I don't know if they went out of business, but they went bankrupt.
Yeah, because the solar panels weren't actually very good.
Well, this company makes batteries for electric cars and hybrid cars. And they got a grant from the U.S. Department of Energy. The total grant is for $118.5 million. They've gotten $55 million so far. But they're doing so badly, they just got delisted from the NASDAQ market.
Ouch. Despite having all that startup capital? How do you manage to do that?
I don't know, but they call it economic stimulus. I don't see how people can say government's going to stimulate the economy when they can't even stimulate the companies they give the money to directly.
I know. I mean, it seems kind of counterproductive. It seems like taking money and destroying it. Heck, probably would have helped the economy more if you just took that pile of money and burned it.
Or just left it alone, because that money either came from people who worked and had a paycheck and got taxed for it, or it came from people who otherwise would have used that money to invest in something else. And maybe the thing they would have invested in would have been a little more worthwhile.
Probably. And it's basically like taking money from your left hand, putting it in your right hand, and taking a bite out of every time and saying, look at me, I'm stimulating my economy. It's insane. Yeah,
you get two guys passing a $20 bill back and forth, and that's going to do about the same amount to stimulate the economy as these government programs.
Yeah, it's just moving money around. It's basically trying to look like you're busy when you're not actually accomplishing anything.
Right. I think a lot of this, though, goes back to FDR. Because, this whole idea of FDR got us out of the Great Depression, the New Deal fixed the Great Depression. No one had that idea for like a few decades afterwards because they lived through it and they knew better. But the thing they said was, well, at least he tried.
Yay.
Yeah, but that's the thing, that led to this mindset of, well, we can't just sit back and do nothing.
Well, you did nothing before. It turned out okay, didn't it?
It seems like the time when our government does sit back and do nothing, things work out a lot better.
Oh, yeah. And the whole thing about how he ended the Great Depression, it's basically rain dance logic, where you do the rain dance every day, and the day it rains, you say, ha-ha, it worked.
Yeah.
Completely disregarding the possibility that maybe that was going to happen even if you didn't do it.
Well, and the probability is it probably would have happened a lot earlier, because if you look at the 2021 Depression, that lasted, a year and 3 months or something like that with a do-nothing government.
Yeah, and then people don't like to talk about that. What I would give for a magic mirror that could change history and show what would have happened if that had taken place, I would pay top dollar for that.
Well, so would a lot of economists. It would make the science a lot easier.
But unfortunately, we can't, so we just got to work with what we got.
But this Inner One company received the 5th largest grant under the stimulus program. And maybe the top 4 are good companies, and maybe they're companies that are going to come through and do all right. And then the government's going to say, hey, look at this. We stimulated these companies and they did well. Well, maybe they would have done well anyway without the stimulus money.
Yeah, and I can ace any test if I get to cancel out any question I got wrong.
Right. Say, Hawk, what time do you have?
It's 4:22 up in British Columbia, Canada.
Well, wait a minute. I got 7:22 here in North Carolina. Is one of our clocks wrong?
No, it's a time zone. You're further ahead, so 12 o'clock is about the same position of the sun, no matter where you are in the world.
Oh, that's right. We live on a spherical planet that rotates. Well, I guess we should all be so glad that we've got a government to set down all these time zones and standardize all this so it's not so confusing, right?
The government did it?
Well, that's the thing a lot of people seem to say, but apparently it didn't work out that way. This is actually an older article from 2002, but since we're flipping back to standard time tonight, this is all going to be in our minds when the podcast comes out. So I thought we might go over it, because originally when the country was first founded, each town kind of did their own thing with the time. And it was, okay, when is the sun directly overhead? Well, that's noon. I mean, we all know that, right? By definition.
Oh, yeah.
But what that meant was that if it's noon in Chicago, it's actually 12:31 in Pittsburgh, 12:24 in Cleveland, 12:13 in Cincinnati, 12:07 in Indianapolis. So all these different cities have all these different times.
And we can all imagine what ensued from that. A lot of scheduling havoc, I would imagine.
Well, at the time, it probably worked because everyone was just doing everything in their local town and there wasn't a lot of rapid transit. Until the railroad started getting laid down and started having all these routes everywhere.
There you go.
It's like that old thing. If a train leaves Chicago at noon, what time will it be in Toledo? Well, imagine what that problem would have been like back then.
Yeah, you have to go slightly forward, slightly back every time you reach a new town. It probably would have been quite an annoying mess trying to keep up with everything.
Right, and you want consistent train schedules, and you want to be able to keep track of your trains, and you want passengers to know when they're leaving and when they're going to be back and things like that.
Yeah, can you imagine back then when you were waiting for a train, you don't know, are you late? Am I on time? Did I add up the math correctly? Because he's going through all these places. So obviously something had to be done about that.
Well, and there were two men who did something. The first one was Professor Charles F. Dowd, and he came up with this idea that he called time belts. And this is exactly what we think of when we think of time zones. We've got these different longitudes that are one area of the globe from north to south that's all one time zone. And then when you go over so far, you kind of click over into the other time zone.
Indeed. So when you cross one, you're just jumping ahead an hour or back an hour, way less jumping in between. So far easier to keep track of, right?
Yeah, well, he got a lot of attention for this idea, but the government just opposed it tooth and nail, just refused to do anything to support it. But it was a railroad engineer named William Frederick Allen. He took his system and he made some improvements to it, and he got a bunch of railroad officials together and created the General Time Convention. And they set up the time zones, and they're the same ones that are in the United States today. And they mapped all those out, figured out what they were going to do, and they implemented it in October of 1883. And the railroads were so widespread at that time that everyone just ended up adopting them because so many things had to be made around the train schedules. You know, when something's getting shipped, when it's getting received, where you're going to be, where you're going to go, that everyone just ended up adopting these on their own.
Yeah, and why wouldn't they? It's far simpler than what they had before.
Well, there were some holdouts. Detroit, I think, was the last holdout. Finally, in 1905, the citizens actually voted to go to Central Time.
Right, so the citizens were in favor of it. It was actually the city officials who were holding out?
Well, the story doesn't really get into it. There were probably some people who were against it. I mean, you've always got that kind of conflict going on there. Some people wanted to do it and some of them didn't. And finally, they just had a referendum about it, and the ones who wanted to join the time zone won.
Oh, yeah. It was inevitable, really. Stubbornness only gets you so far when you're basically just inconveniencing yourself.
But even then, the federal government kept fighting it. And a lot of these people said you were violating the authority of the sun.
The authority of the sun?
The authority of the sun.
How did they figure that?
Well, because the sun is directly up in the sky at noon, so if that's where the sun is, that's where noon is. But now you've got these places where in noon the sun isn't at the top of the sky. It's a little bit forward or it's a little bit behind.
Well, I don't think anyone was ever too inconvenienced by the position of the sun being at noon. I mean, priorities, people.
Yeah. But it took them until March 1918 to standardize it.
Yeah, it's just interesting. People say, oh, but if we don't have the government to enforce it, they'll have some holdouts mucking up the works. Well, you look through history, consistently, it ends up being politicians being the stubborn holdouts getting in the way of things. It's just more of that topsy-turvy stuff we talked about earlier.
Yeah. But the rest of the world actually got on board a little quicker. 1884, the year after they implemented the standards, there were representatives from 15 different countries, and they debated the time zones, and there was a lot of support for it, so they ended up going with it, but there was a lot of political wrangling back and forth, and that's actually why Greenwich Observatory in England is the prime meridian instead of, the railroads, in Chicago or wherever, where this idea was actually born.
Oh, they'll fight over the silliest things, don't they?
Well, I think we can at least be glad that they didn't have to deal with the effects of relativity as well. That could have been messy.
Oh, dear. And daylight savings time, that was a government invention, wasn't it?
I think Ben Franklin originally came up with the idea.
I don't remember the exact reasoning, but as I recall, the purpose for it is pretty much long out of date now, isn't it?
Well, no one can seem to agree on a reason for doing it. Some people say, well, you do it to save energy, except it doesn't save energy. And, well, you do it to get more daylight hours at the end of the day, but then you change it back in the winter where there are fewer daylight hours and you can actually use more daylight at the end of the day.
If you want more daylight hours, just get up earlier.
Well, that's something, and they're like, some people say, oh, you have to go back in the fall because otherwise students will be going to school in the dark and you don't want kids going out in the dark. Well, just start school an hour later.
Sure, why not?
Why mess up everyone's schedules just for the schools? So I don't really know. It's just, I think at some point we might be getting to a point where we'll just say, look, forget these confusing time zones entirely. We're all just going to use Greenwich Mean Time. And then we'll base everything off of that. Because really, does it matter to you if you go to school at 8 o'clock in the morning or at 10 p.m. in the morning or whatever, whatever it's called?
Oh, some people would freak out about it, but personally, I think you'd get over it pretty quickly. It wouldn't take that long to get used to.
Well, it'd be an adjustment, just like trying to go to the metric system, which our country, well, my country actually, still refuses to do. I think Canada's metric, isn't it?
Yes, which is a pain because I work for an American company, so they use imperial in the place, which just drives me crazy because I never learned much about it at school because we don't use it.
Oh, but it's so simple. It's 12 inches to the foot, 3 feet to the yard, and 5,280 feet to the mile. You can remember that, can't you?
I forgot it already.
It's kind of like when Britain went from the old monetary system, 20 shillings to the pound, and was it 12 pence to the shilling? And then they went over to the decimal system, which is what both our countries have, so much easier, and yet everyone was saying, this is too confusing, I can't handle it. People just don't like change. They get their minds stuck in this old way of doing things, and they got to kind of shift gears to go to it.
Yeah, and you would get over it really quickly, and I say this as someone who's got a memory that's really stubborn to change. Like, I still keep remembering my own phone numbers all the time. It drives me crazy.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's really sad, but I can still sing you every word and note of the Bert the Turtle song.
Oh, yeah, I got lots of stuff from my childhood. I can remember the old books I used to read.
Duck and cover. It bothers me that there's a place in my brain that is dedicated to nothing other than remembering that.
Yeah, the songs to my old TV shows as a kid.
Yeah, but that probably wasn't government propaganda about the Cold War.
Sweden. Whenever they see governments all over the world doing bad things, abusing people's rights, they're always quick to jump in and say, well, they're just a bunch of tyrants. You should see our track record. We treat our people right. We've got a great human rights track record.
Are you saying they don't?
Well, for the most part they do. Unless, of course, you're a transgendered person, then they just don't count. Now, being a transgender person is not easy if even half the stories I've heard about it are true, and I've had at least one friend who was. In this case, we have a Swedish transgender actress by the name of Aleksa Lundberg. I think I got that right. She's undergone all the surgeries and all the other things you have to go through, which is, in itself, is not an easy thing to deal with. But her government, just to add insult to injury, decided, hey, you also have to get sterilized if you undergo the procedure. And
let's be clear here, they're not just talking like a vasectomy, they're talking about complete removal of the sexual organs.
Yes, indeed. And the reasoning for it is it would interfere with social roles or something like that.
The thing that gets me is they even say you can't freeze your sperm or your eggs before you do it and have a child later. It's just like complete wipeout.
Yes, indeed. It's like they want to get you out of the gene pool or something like that. It's disgusting.
So I guess you have to have your kid before you go through all that.
Yeah. And there's a really dark tone to this. When a government's stepping in and tell you, if you have this surgery, you also have to have this surgery because we say so. In order to take a position like that, you have to believe that these people belong to you. They are your property.
Yes.
It's what affirms my belief that politicians are people who just couldn't quite give up on the idea of slavery.
Well, here's one quote from Lundberg in the article. It infuriates me that a group of people think they have a right to tell another group of people what they can and cannot do. But isn't that the very essence of government?
Yes, indeed. It's sad she had to learn that lesson the hard way like this, and like so many other people do.
Reading the story of hers, because she just accepted it for so long and then came to realize truly what it was all about, it kind of reminds me of these battered spouses, and they stick with their husbands, and even when they get away, they're still making excuses and everything, and it's only years later they can go back and see it for what it was.
Yeah, it is in every way an abusive relationship.
The most telling thing about this is that the people who support the law, according to the article, don't want you to call the sterilization forcible.
Oh, how is it not forcible? What if she undergoes the surgery and refuses the sterilization? What do you think's going to happen? The government's just going to politely ask her to?
I'm kind of thinking, like, how do they check?
Oh, I don't even want to get into that.
But it is forcible. You know, everything the government does is force, but this is just so much greater force than almost anything else government has done, except for, like you said, slavery.
Yeah, you could call this legitimized raping almost.
It's forced genital mutilation.
Yes, indeed. And how many years in prison would you get forever trying to pressure someone in this way if you were not a politician? If you even spoke in support of somebody who did this, you would be ostracized. Like, everyone would look at you like you were the lowest life form that ever lived. And yet, politicians do it, and there's people supporting it. How do they not see the difference?
Well, even the people who are opposing it, the people who want the law repealed, aren't looking at these supporters in the way you just described, like we'd look at private citizens who took this viewpoint. It's just, they're the opposition and we're going against them like always, but it's just part of the system.
It's simple. This is what governments can't seem to understand. If there's anything that you indisputably own, it's your body. I'm sorry, but there's no excuse to be made for this sort of thing. It's just terrible.
You got your clue on umbrella?
Yeah.
Well, there might be a deluge from this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And this week it's a Dutch psychologist named Diederik Stapel, and he discovered some amazing things. For example, did you know human aggression is caused by eating meat?
No, I never heard of that.
Wow. What about the fact that table manners will improve if there's a glass of wine just sitting on the table?
No, that's interesting.
Oh, and my favorite, discrimination is caused by litter.
By litter?
Litter.
Ooh, this could be a big breakthrough. Where did he find all this stuff?
Well, apparently he just made it all up.
Oh, naughty.
They've investigated this guy, and they found over 30 papers just since 2004 that are complete outright fakes. He didn't do anything. He just made up data and published it. And apparently there were some others that they're looking at that they're thinking that he might have actually done surveys with and then just ignored the results and substituted his own.
And as I understand the scientific community, that's somewhat frowned upon.
Yeah, they don't like it when you do that.
I mean, what is the kind of thinking behind someone who thinks he can do this and get away with it? That in the scientific community of all places, no one's ever going to check his facts to see where he got them from.
But that's the interesting thing. This is psychology, and social sciences are a little bit difficult when it comes to this sort of thing than the physical sciences. In the physical sciences, you just set up the experiment, and it either works or it doesn't. This is a little weird. You can say, oh, send me your data, and he just sends you the data that he made up. And so this just went on for years and years. And one thing I think is telling was that it was junior researchers who came in, found out about this, and blew the whistle on him.
Yeah, it's surprising how often that happens, because they have no preconceived notions, so they tend to look at it with a little less prejudice.
But the scope of this is just amazing. They're even looking at the PhD research of his own graduate students and even his own PhD.
Yeah, and you get that ripple effect. Now that he's been found to have lied, now they got to check back on everything he's done before and everyone he's taught and found what else was a lie. That's trying to sort out what was true and what wasn't now.
If that doesn't make him this week's biggest Bogon emitter, I don't know what would. Well, Hawk, get your waders on and make sure your shots are up to date, because we're going to slog through the mind of this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire!
And guess what? It's another creationist.
Oh, goody, goody, goody. What unique and new argument have they got this time?
Well, none, of course, but in this case, it's Ken Mercer, who is with the Texas State Board of Education, and he was one of those guys who kept trying to get creationism stuck into the classrooms.
Well, at least you can't fault them for being quitters.
True, but they're still going on the whole thing about teach the controversy and let students know both sides and, teach both the theory and the problems with the theory, all that kind of stuff.
You know what? When I was watching that, I had a sudden epiphany. Maybe they're right. I proposed this. Next time they're at church, why just teach the Christianity aspect of the arguments? I mean, they don't know everything, of course. We let a Jewish priest in, we let an Islam priest in, we let, Scientologists, and an atheist too. Let's not leave anybody out. We let them all preach to the kids, and they can decide for themselves which one seems to make the most sense.
Yeah, somehow I don't think they'll go for that.
Nobody ever likes my ideas.
Well, just to see the kind of repetition that's going on, listen to this.
That the most important thing, the new books we just approved, all three major publishers teach evolution as a theory now. It's clear. It's clearly delineated. It is a theory now. It is a theory now where the far left definitely want to be taught as fact.
So again, we have a guy who's working on the educational curriculum for one of the biggest states in the Union who doesn't even know what the words theory and fact mean when you're talking in science.
I mean, last I checked, gravity is a theory, but I don't think there's much of a debate on it.
Well, gravity is a theory and a fact, just like evolution is a theory and a fact.
And the thing these people don't get is, even if there was as much uncertainty about evolution as they claim to be, well, so what? That doesn't mean that religion gets to be held equal to it. I mean, this should be considered alongside this, even though my theory has got absolutely nothing going for it evidence-wise.
Right.
And the funny thing is, they criticize science for changing its mind. Old Testament, New Testament, anybody?
Well, the Old Testament says eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and Jesus comes along and says, yeah, ignore that part.
I thought changing your mind was a bad thing. How come suddenly it's a good thing now?
Well, if you thought that was silly, listen to this.
I go downtown, any downtown, you'll see thousands of stray cats, stray dogs. But I've never seen a cat, half dog. If your theory is right, all these species would get together and form a new species, and where is the cat dog? They don't come together. Cats go with cats, and dogs go with dogs.
Well, of course they do, because if they did anything else, that would falsify evolution.
I mean, that's not how one species becomes another at all. I mean, if you're going to argue against something, the least you can do is actually understand it first.
See, there you go with your radical ideas again.
Oh, well, someone has to.
But that's actually the direction I think the classes should start to go when they teach evolution, because he says this over and over again, the kids need to ask questions. I mean, listen to this bit.
But we allow kids the freedom to ask questions in class, and that's where the far left went berserk. They even said, again, they said, quote, high school students are unqualified to ask questions. And I said, you could never stand in a classroom.
Well, I mean, you are unqualified to ask a question about something if you don't understand it first. You have to understand what it is in order to call it into question. And so the idea that I think they should start going with is saying, okay, class, I don't care what you believe. My job is to help you understand the science of evolution. That's what you'll be tested on, not your beliefs, but your understanding of the material. If you want to reject it, go for it. Just understand what it is you're rejecting.
You're a student. You're not going to disprove a theory that old with them that little know-how. You really need to look more into it if you're ever going to have a hope of doing that.
Yeah, like you're going to think of something in 5 minutes that all of these scientists that have been working on the problem for 150 years have never ever thought of even once.
Yeah, the first step to wisdom is understanding your limitations. I don't believe I am smarter than all the collective scientists who have done this for all these years. I understand that. It's just arrogance to the point of insanity.
It really is, which is why Ken Mercer is this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire.
Well, that wraps up this dialogical edition of the Bogosity podcast. Please visit the forums of Bogosity.tv, where you can read the show notes and participate in discussions about these subjects and anything else you'd like. And if you'd like to participate in the Bogosity podcast, you can send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@Bogosity.tv. If you put it in an MP3 file, it just might get played in the podcast. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Lord T. Hawkeye, for joining me.
Hey, no problem. Call on me anytime.
I will. Next week, I'll be out of town on business, so we'll see you in 2 weeks. Until then, here's a quote from Ashleigh Brilliant. Why am I so often at the mercy of those who don't deserve to control my life? The Bogosity podcast is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 Unported license.
Bogosity.